When the centurion reported, according to military custom, that he had executed the command, Tiberius replied that he had not given the command, and that the act must be justified to the Senate. As soon as Sallustius Crispus, who shared the secret (he had, in fact, sent the written order to the tribune), knew this, fearing that the charge would be shifted on himself, and that his peril would be the same whether he uttered fiction or truth, he advised Livia not to divulge the secrets of her house, or the counsels of her friends, or any services performed by the soldiers, nor to let Tiberius weaken the strength of imperial power by referring everything to the Senate. For the condition, he said, of holding empire is that an account cannot be balanced unless it be rendered to one person. Meanwhile, at Rome, people plunged into slavery. Consuls, senators, knights. The higher a man's rank, the more eager his hypocrisy, and his looks the more carefully studied, so as neither to betray joy at the decease of one emperor, nor sorrow at the rise of another, while he mingled delight and lamentations with his flattery. Sextus Pompeius and Sextus Apuleius, the consuls, were the first to swear allegiance to Tiberius Caesar, and in their presence the oath was taken by Seu Strabo and Gaius Turannius, respectively the commander of the praetorian cohorts and the superintendent of the corn supplies. Then the Senate, the soldiers, and the people did the same, for Tiberius would inaugurate everything with the consuls, as though the ancient constitution remained, and he hesitated about being emperor. Even the proclamation by which he summoned the senators to their chamber he issued merely with the title of tribune, which he had received under Augustus. The wording of the proclamation was brief, and in a very modest tone. He would, it said, provide for the honors due to his father, and not leave the lifeless body, and that it was the only public duty he now claimed. As soon, however, as Augustus was dead, he had given the watchword to the praetorian cohorts as commander-in-chief. He had the guard under arms, with all the other adjuncts of a court. Soldiers attended him to the forum. Soldiers went with him to the Senate house. He sent letters to the different armies, as though superior power was now his, and showed hesitation only when he spoke in the Senate. His chief motive was fear that Germanicus, who had at his disposal so many legions, such vast auxiliary forces of the allies, and such wonderful popularity, might prefer the possession to the expectation of empire. He looked also at public opinion, wishing to have the credit of having been called and elected by the Senate, rather than having crept into power through the intrigues of a wife and a dotard's adoption. It was subsequently understood that he assumed a wavering attitude, to test likewise the temper of the nobles, for he would twist a word or a look into a crime, and treasure it up in his memory. On the first day of the Senate he allowed nothing to be discussed but the funeral of Augustus, whose will, which was brought in by the Vestal Virgins, named as his heirs Tiberius and Livia. The latter was to be admitted into the Julian family with the name of Augusta. Next in expectation were the grand and great-grandchildren. In the third place he had named the chief men of the state, most of whom he hated, simply out of ostentation and to win credit with posterity. His legacies were not beyond the scale of a private citizen, except a bequest of 43,500,000 sesterces to the people and populace of Rome, of 1,000 to every praetorian soldier, and of 300 to every man in the legionary cohorts composed of Roman citizens. Next followed a deliberation about funeral honors. Of those, the most imposing were thought fitting. The procession was to be conducted through the Gate of Triumph, on the motion of Gallus Asinius. The titles of the laws passed. The names of the nations conquered by Augustus were to be borne in front, on that of Lucius Arruntius. Messala Valerius further proposed that the oath of allegiance to Tiberius should be yearly renewed, and when Tiberius asked him whether it was at his bidding that he had brought forward this motion, he replied that he had proposed it spontaneously, and that in whatever concerning the state he would use only his own discretion, even at the risk of offending. This was the only style of adulation which yet remained. The senators unanimously exclaimed that the body ought to be borne on their shoulders to the funeral pile. The emperor left the point to them with disdainful moderation. He then admonished the people by a proclamation not to indulge in that tumultuous enthusiasm which had distracted the funeral of the divine Julius, or express a wish that Augustus should be burnt in the Forum instead of in his appointed resting place on the Campus Martius. On the day of the funeral, soldiers stood round as a guard, amid much ridicule from those who had either themselves witnessed or had heard from their parents of the famous day when slavery was still something fresh, and freedom had been resought in vain, when the slaying of Caesar the dictator seemed to some the vilest, to others the most glorious of deeds. Now, they said, an aged sovereign, whose power has lasted long, who had provided his heirs with abundant means to coerce the state, requires, forsooth, the defense of soldiers that his burial may be undisturbed. Then followed much talk about Augustus himself, and many expressed an idle wonder that the same day marked the beginning of his assumption of empire and the close of his life, and again that he had ended his days at Nola in the same house and room as his father Octavius. People extolled too the number of his consulships, in which he equalled Valerius Corvus and Gaius Marius combined, the continuance for 37 years of the tribunician power, the title of imperator 21 times earned, and his other honors which had either frequently repeated or were wholly new. Sensible men, however, spoke variously of his life with praise and censure. Some said that dutiful feelings towards a father and the necessities of the state, in which the laws had then no place, drove him into civil war, which can neither be planned nor conducted by any right principles. He had often yielded to Antonius, while he was taking vengeance on his father's murderers, often also to Lepidus. When the latter sank into feeble dotage, and the former had been ruined by his profligacy, the only remedy for his distracted country was a rule of a single man. Yet the state had been organized under the name neither of a kingdom nor a dictatorship, but under that of a prince. The ocean and remote rivers were the boundaries of the empire. The legions, provinces, fleets, all things were linked together. There was law for the citizens, there was respect shown to the allies. The capital had been embellished on a grand scale. Only in a few instances had he resorted to force, simply to secure general tranquillity. It was said, on the other hand, that filial duty and state necessity were merely assumed as a mask. It was really from a lust of sovereignty that he had excited the veterans by bribery, when a young man and a subject raised an army, tampered with the consul's legions, and feigned an attachment to the faction of Pompeius. Then, when by a decree of the Senate he usurped the high functions and authority of praetor, when Hirtius and Pansa were slain, whether they were destroyed by the enemy, or Pansa by poison infused into a wound, Hirtius by his own soldiers and Caesar's treacherous machinations, he at once possessed himself of both their armies, wrested the consulate from a reluctant senate, and turned against the state the arms which he had been entrusted against Antonius. Citizens were proscribed, lands divided, without so much as the approval of those who executed these deeds. Even granting that the deaths of Cassius and of the Bruti were sacrifices to a hereditary enmity, though duty requires us to waive private feuds for the sake of the public welfare, still Pompeius had been deluded by the phantom of peace, and Lepidus by the mask of friendship. Subsequently, Antonius had been lured on by the treaties of Tarentum and Brundisium, and by his marriage with his sister, and had paid by his death the penalty of a treacherous alliance. No doubt there was peace after all this, but it was a peace stained with blood. There were the disasters of Lollius and Varus, the murders at Rome of the Varros, Ignatii, and Julii. The domestic life, too, of Augustus was not spared. Nero's wife had been taken from him, and there had been the farce of consulting the pontiffs whether, with a child conceived and not yet born, she could properly marry. There were the excesses of Quintus Tedius and Vedius Pollio. Last of all, there was Livia, terrible to the state as a mother, terrible to the house of the Caesars as a stepmother. No honor was left for the gods when Augustus chose to be himself worshipped with temples and statues, like those of the deities, and with flamens and priests. He had not even